Okay, it's 1 p.m, so we'll make a start. Welcome everyone to this ScHARR mini masterclass. Welcome especially to those of you who are new to the masterclass series. Hopefully this will spark your interest for the remainder of the sessions that we've got booked for the going into 2021. I'm Claire Beecroft, I'm a university teacher at ScHARR, and I'm introducing today and I'll be moderating the questions. Just before we begin, I'm going to explain a little bit about Blackboard Collaborate and how you interact on it for those of you that might not be fully familiar with it. So you should at the moment be looking at a screen that looks a little bit like this. So in terms of interacting, all you really need to know about today is the chat box. So if you click the little purple tab in the bottom right-hand corner, the chat window should appear. If you click on the little speech bubble icon, open it up, you'll be able to type questions in there. And the way that we run these sessions generally is that you can type questions at any point throughout the session, but we will take questions at the end. And depending on how many questions there are, I may need to moderate them a bit and possibly consolidate questions if we have 2 or 3 questions that are more or less the same. If you're having any issues with audio or video, if you click on the settings cog, that will open up the menu where you can double check which microphone your computer is using, what speakers your computer is using, and you might be able to solve any problems by making some adjustments there. So back to my slides. So welcome to our mini masterclass. Before we proceed with the session today, I'll just flag up that we have the first session booked for January 2021 is with Professor Stephen Walters, and it's the ABC of RCTs. I'll ask one of the other moderators if they can put a link to that in the chat box. So if you want to sign up for that already, then the booking is open for that one now, and these sessions are always at 1 p.m. UK time. So today our speaker is Colin Angus, who's going to be talking about visualising the COVID-19 pandemic. I suspect Colin is familiar to many of you through his alter ego on Twitter at Victim of Mass, where he's been posting visualisations and tweets about the COVID-19 pandemic right since the beginning back in March. Colin joined ScHARR in 2011. Previous to that, he did a BSc in Maths at Warwick University and was working in industry. And when he joined ScHARR in 2011, he also enrolled on our MSc in Health Economics and Decision Modelling, and I'll talk briefly about that in a moment. Colin's currently a Senior Research Fellow in the Sheffield Alcohol Research Group, and his research is based on the development of Sheffield alcohol policy models to incorporate new methodological developments, new data, and to answer new policy questions both in the UK and internationally. Colin also teaches on our MSc postgraduate diploma and postgraduate certificate program in health economics and decision modelling, which has been running for over a decade now. So if you want to learn more about the program that Colin teaches on, then again, I'll put the link in the chat box so you can follow that up later. But for now, I'll hand over to Colin, and Colin, I will upload your slides ready for you before you begin.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Can I just check you can hear me? Super. All right, well, thank you very much. Excuse me, sorry, I'm just getting over a bit of a cold, so if I stop making sense, then I'll just have muted myself for a little cough or a sneeze. Okay, so thanks very much to my lovely colleagues for organising this and for inviting me to come and talk to you all. It's interesting to be able to have an opportunity to talk about something that isn't alcohol policy. So let's see if I can make my slides work. Yes, right. So the title here is Visualising the COVID-19 Pandemic, but I like to try and give my presentations kind of a subtitle, right, which reflects how I really feel about what I'm saying. And I think I'll kind of come back to the idea of doing this a bit later, but the subtitle here is Using Pretty Pictures to Make Sense of Horrible Numbers. which is basically what I've been doing for a lot of the last 9 months. So this is me. Hello. As you've already heard, my normal job is designing, developing, and using complex mathematical models to estimate the impact of different types of alcohol policy on drinking, on public health, and on the wider economy. But what I'm really interested in beyond this is how different policies affect different groups in the population. So I'm really interested in understanding, if you introduce some policy, does that have a bigger effect on older people or younger people, men or women, more deprived groups, less deprived groups, different ethnic groups, all sorts of, different variations. So that's what I'm really interested in, which I think is kind of relevant, I guess, to what's been happening, and very relevant. I've always enjoyed playing with data and drawing graphs of stuff. And I've learnt this year that I don't really handle global crises very well. I found, as I'm sure many of you have, this year has been incredibly tough. And actually, what I've found is that one way of trying to make sense of everything that's gone on is to try and draw graphs of it. I mean, that's often how I try and make sense of new bits of data, new information, is drawing graphs of things. So this has kind of been my coping mechanism in a sense. And although it's nice that lots of people seem to have got some value out of some of the things that I've been doing, really a lot of it's quite selfish. It's just me trying to understand what's going on for my own ends. I think it's useful to clarify what I'm definitely not, right? I'm definitely not a virologist. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm definitely not a statistician. And I'm absolutely not a professional data visualization ninja, right? So here's a couple of examples of what I view as proper data visualizations, right? This is kind of very much verging on the sort of the art side of data visualization. These here from Nadia Bremer and Cedric Scherer, I think, who are both, fabulous data visualization people. I'm never going to make stuff like this, but that doesn't mean that there aren't interesting stories to tell and interesting ways to tell them. I think you don't need to be an amazing artist in order to create interesting and useful visualizations. But there are some things, I think, which have, from my background in alcohol policy and research, which have given me a particularly good handle, I guess, or good background skills for what's been happening, right? So I have a really good understanding of UK health data, not just for England, but from the work that we've done in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. I understand what data is available for those countries around health, and how that data looks different, and where we can get it differently for the different UK nations. So that's been extremely useful. I love a good spot of data wrangling. I'm good at asking really annoying questions. Anyone that's ever worked with me will know that I love to ask annoying questions, and so I think that's been really important in terms of understanding what data is available and what data isn't available, but also what the data that's available means, right? Is that I'm not afraid of bugging the people that have created the data to go, well, does this number mean this or does it this? Which I think is really useful. And I think this is incredibly important. I like to think about how we can present data in a way that tells a story. I think that's kind of a key aspect of any good data visualization, is telling a story, and that's something that we'll come back to a bit more later on. And I guess it's fair to say that I have form for drawing graphs of some fairly morbid outcomes, right? Some people, with good reason, are a bit wary about visualizing things that can be quite, if you reflect on the underlying data, it can be quite distressing. And I guess it's always important to remember that when you're drawing graphs of deaths, for example, these are real people who've died. There are huge numbers of individual tragedies in this data. But I've long been very interested in in death and questions around death. So I have previous on this. So I have a whole repo on my GitHub account which is called Deaths of Despair, right? And that's been there for ages. I'm I've long been interested in these kind of morbid things. drawing graphs like this, for example. So my my partner has a habit of walking past my computer sometimes and seeing some visualization that I have on screen and going, "Oh, that's nice. Maybe we should get it printed out and put on the wall. What is it?" And inevitably when I tell her what it is, she goes, maybe not. So this one here, this is patterns over time and deaths from suicide, right? So, you know, as I said, it's important to think about the tragedies here, right? I know some of the data points in this graph, but that doesn't mean that we can't you know, look at it and try and understand the patterns. And lastly, I'm really committed to transparency in analysis and visualization of data. So, you know, I've alongside all this complicated modeling stuff that I do in my job, I also have for quite a while enjoyed doing little sort of bits of ad hoc analysis. You know, if there's a paper which has some interesting tables in it, or the government publishes some new routine data, I'll do a little bit of analysis, and I'll post a few graphs, maybe a bit of a thread on Twitter about, you know, what I think the data's telling us. And a little while ago, maybe 18 months ago, I made a decision that whenever I was doing bits of analysis like that, I was always going to try and post a link to the code that I used to do that analysis, so that other people could replicate what I'm doing. And also so that it's to be transparent, right? So other people can see what I've done and can criticize me if I've done something wrong, or you know, make suggestions for improvement. So I think that's you know, really important part of everything that's been going on in these last 9 months, is this sort of this transparency. So I'm going to rewind a bit back to March, if you can remember back that long. Basically, along with, I suspect, a lot of you, were kind of sitting watching this graph here, which is created by John Byrne-Murdoch, data visualization expert at the Financial Times. And, you know, I felt like there wasn't really any point in me visualizing COVID data at this stage, because in a sense, people like John Byrne-Murdoch have got it nailed, right? There's nothing more that I can add. These graphics like this are incredibly useful and powerful and tell us what's going on. And there's nothing more that I can do, right? So I was just cracking on as best I could with my normal job. And then public health academic called Martin White tweeted this question back on the 2nd of April, saying, you know, can anyone point me to data where we can look at variation in cases and deaths from COVID by demographic factors, particularly socioeconomic position? So this is going back to what I was saying before. This is kind of the area that I'm really interested in. And another public health academic replied saying, oh, well, actually the Public Health England dashboard has data on cases by local authority, and you can get an estimate of deprivation at the local authority level with some limitations. And so then Martin replied and said, oh, has someone got time to do this? And my colleague, John Holmes, who basically is all his fault, he just atted me, you know, knowing correctly that this is something I would find very interesting. And so I immediately got on the case, and I drew some graphs and found that actually, so we've got here cases over time colored by deprivation level, with darker colors being greater deprivation. And actually there's not a huge pattern. I was kind of expecting to see much higher case numbers in more deprived local authorities, but that wasn't really the case. So actually this kind of initial foray into COVID data visualization wasn't really very successful in the sense of telling a story, although sometimes finding that there's no story is a story in and of itself. But I also immediately fell into all of these arguments that were going on at the time and are still going on about whether you should be presenting absolute numbers of cases or rates of cases, whether you should be showing things on a log scale or a linear scale. All these, you know, very good and interesting arguments, to which I don't think there's really a right answer, but I'll come back to that. But anyway, so from these humble beginnings, I guess everything else came. And then this is, so for those of you who don't know what this graphic represents, on GitHub, which is where I post all of the R code that I write for my analysis, these little, this is just a little grid here showing the days that I've uploaded something or made some edit to GitHub. And grey days are when I didn't do anything, and green days are when I uploaded something, and the darker green the more that I did. And so this point here is basically that's where I started drawing COVID graphs. So you can see that suddenly I went from not doing too much to doing an awful lot. So basically I fell off the wagon. And yeah, it's all been uphill or downhill from there. Anyway, I'll stop waffling now about the background. This is probably what you're all thinking, and start talking about some of the actual graphs themselves. So I'm going to start with this one, showing excess mortality, right? So there's a lot of argument right back at the beginning of the initial phases of the pandemic about how we could possibly separate out which deaths were really from COVID and which weren't. What's the true mortality impact of the pandemic? Because lots of people were dying without ever having been tested for COVID. Some people were dying of other things while they had COVID, and there was concerns that maybe that meant that we were overcounting or undercounting, or who really knows. And so the least complicated measure that you can use is just to look at the total number of people dying in the country. And so that's what this measure shows. So I'm just going to go through this in a bit of detail, I guess. And the first thing to say is that, I mean, I love thinking up. I love to be creative, but I'm not really a great person for pulling new ideas out of nothing. I tend to be much better at taking other people's ideas and running with them a lot. And so a lot of what I've done has been taking inspiration from things that other people have done, and sometimes that inspiration is substantial, and sometimes it's quite tangential, I guess. But here it's quite clear, right? So I saw this graph and I thought, oh, this is great, right? So this is Ed Conway, who's a journalist at Sky, had done this to look at excess mortality. And so what I did was basically just to recreate this, but I made a few slight changes. So if we look at this version, you can see that I've colored in the area under the line. So I've colored in the area in pink. And the motivation for doing that is the total area of that space is the total number of excess deaths. And so if what you're interested in measuring is the number of excess deaths, then that's the kind of how big that area is. That's what you're really interested in. And so given that that was the key kind of takeaway from the graph, I thought it was important to try and highlight it rather than just showing the red line, which is the total number of people that have died. One of the other differences is that I've got that red annotation there in the middle, actually describing how many people that pink area represents in both absolute terms, so 54,782 at that point, and also in relative terms. So that's a 27% increase, because different people will find different ones of those numbers useful, right? To many people, just saying, nearly 55,000 deaths, that sounds like a huge number. So that's all that people really need to know. But some other people want to know, you may not have a good intuitive sense of how many people die in the UK every day or every year. And so it's useful to have a comparison, right? It might be that you can get to a massive number and actually that only reflects a 1% increase. And so it's useful to have both, I think. And then the other little tweaks are up there in the legend. So if we go back to the original here, this just says weekly deaths and gives the source. Whereas here, the title here is giving you the story, right? So it says deaths from all causes are continuing to fall sharply, right? This is telling you what I think the story in this graph here is. And then I've got one of these the subtitle here has the kind of the legend showing 2020 in red and previous years in blue, kind of in the text of the legend, which I think is a really neat trick. Again, that I borrowed from someone else. I'm not going to claim authorship on that. So this was my kind of take on that graph, and I think it's interesting. Something that I've thought about a lot over the last few years as I've got more interested in data visualization as an end in and of itself is how the way that we as academics visualize data in our papers when we're talking to each other versus how we visualize it when we're trying to communicate it to other people, and whether that's sensible. So I thought it might be fun to try and make a version of that graph as I would expect to see it in an academic paper. So this is my version of that there, right? This is the kind of thing you see in a paper. So the first thing to note is there's no color, because we're a bit terrified of color. for some unfathomable reason. There's a few other important differences, right? We've used different line types here to highlight the different years. I'm showing all of the years. We've got different hatchings. It's impossible to tell which is which. I've got a title, but it's really uninformative. Okay, it's just a description of kind of the basic, like the data. It doesn't tell you anything about the story. And then the actual number that I'm really interested in, right, the total number of excess deaths, that's buried in the text somewhere else. It's not even in the graph. So I think these are all bad things that we do as academics, right? And so I've got a few kind of lessons, right? That makes me sad. I've got a few lessons, but before we get to that, I think it's useful to think about what you're trying to do with a graph, right? So I think there are two different kinds of graphs. There are those that seek to convey a really clear message, and then there are those where you're trying to allow people to study them, look over them, you know, for minutes or days or hours, and find their own messages in the data. Okay, and I was having a discussion with a few people, including John Murdoch, the other day, and he kind of articulated this quite nicely, right? And saying that he's pivoted from the second of these, right, the graphic that most people like him would pore over for hours, to the first kind, the graphic that thousands of people will get use of out in 1 minute. So I think there's these two different kinds, right? And I think it's important when you're creating a visualization that you pick one. Don't try and do both. Right, and then embrace that choice. So, you know, choose whether you're trying to get across a simple message in your graph, and if that's what you're trying to do, then don't worry that you're going to lose some of the subtlety in the information when you do that. If that's your aim, if your aim is to convey a single clear message, make the graph which most effectively does that. And any design choices you make that are getting away from that is bad. And I think, you know, if you're not sure about this, a bit like I was talking about right back at the beginning with your presentations, right, try and give it a pithy title. Imagine, like, I almost always try and give my graphs a title which describes what I think the story is. And I often find that if I can't write a title which describes what the story of the graph is in a short enough thing that fits as the title of a graph, then it's probably the second kind of graph, right? It's not the first kind, because I'm not trying to, you know, I can't convey the story of what I'm trying to show in the graph in just a simple, you know, sentence. The alternative is, if you can't think of a nice pithy summary, is that you've made a bad graph, right? And maybe you need to go back and sound and kind of revisit some of your choices. Maybe try visualizing the data in a slightly different way, and you might find that then you can work out what the story is. Okay. So, as I was saying, I think it's really important that we tell a story when creating graphics, right? And a way to do this is, like I was just saying, use the title and also the subtitle and the captions. So I can see someone in the comments here saying, when I say the title, weekly death continue to go down. That's exactly what I mean, right? So I mean something like the first words you see at the top of the graph are saying, you know, deaths are falling, or just a nice pithy summary which tells you what people should be expecting to see in the actual graphic itself. I think we should learn to love annotations, right? As academics, we tend to try and avoid annotating graphs, and we just write these really long, tedious captions underneath which explain everything that's going on. But it's much easier to just draw an arrow pointing to an interesting bit of the graph and say, this is the interesting bit, here's what's going on here. You don't have to give all of the data equal prominence, okay? So in the academic version of the graph, I was trying to show every one of the 11 years that were included in the graph. But actually, that's not the important thing, right? We're not interested in whether 2012 was different from 2013. If our question is, how is 2020 different from the years that went before, we're only really interested in the range. So let's throw away some of that information because it's not relevant, and let's just focus on the really valuable bit. And highlight the important bits, right? So don't feel like you have to use a kind of a color palette that makes all of your every bit of the graph look similar, right? It's fine to wash a load of the color out in gray because that bit's not important, and just pick out one line or one thing in a bright color because that's the bit you want people to focus on. So I think these are all really useful techniques to try and help tell a story with graphs, right? And so you can see some of these things here. So at the point when I drew this graph, right, deaths were falling sharply. So the title just says deaths are falling sharply. You can see that I've hidden some of the year variation because it wasn't interesting. I'm just showing the maximum and minimum. And I've used annotations to show the key numbers, and I've picked out 2020 in red because it's important. Red's a good color for highlighting stuff because it immediately grabs your attention. And then don't be afraid to double encode important information. What I mean by that is there's lots of different ways in a graph that you can encode information. You can use color, you can use position, you can use size, you can use shade, all sorts of things. And if you've got something really important, you're allowed to use more than one of those things at once, okay? Because that just makes it more likely that people will be drawn to it, right? So in these graphs here, this is splitting out the all-cause mortality by age group, okay? The pink area is telling you the number of excess deaths. So really, you only need to compare the size of the pink area to know whether you have more excess deaths in one group than another. But but I've also added annotations because I think it's so important knowing the difference between these areas that I think it's useful to draw particular additional attention to that. So I've kind of double encoded that information in the graph, and I think that's fine. You know, that's great. That's to be encouraged. I think this is something that I've really come to realize, particularly over the last 9 months, right? There is no one supreme graph to rule them all, right? You cannot draw the everything graph, so don't try, okay? So this is another similar version to the previous that we were just looking at, but this is showing excess deaths in Italy in different Italian regions. So I made a version of this plot here, right? And the focus, the kind of the takeaway here is in the title, the excess deaths in Italy were very heavily concentrated in the northern regions. So Lombardy, Emilia-Romagna, and other areas, for example, Lazio, that's where Rome is, had negative excess deaths at the start of the year. So this was my presentation of this data. And then I got quite alarmed when I saw the Financial Times created a version of this graph, right? And so you can see we've made some very similar design choices, but the area under the graphs for some of these other areas, so Piedmont, for example, Valle d'Aosta, are quite different. And that initially alarmed me. And then, but if you look a bit harder, you can see that each one of these graphs here in this Financial Times version is on a different scale, right? So the scale for the Valle d'Aosta only goes up to 100, whereas for Lombardy, it goes up to 7,500. That's because Lombardy is a much, much bigger area. And so these two graphs are telling you different things. They're answering different questions. So if we go back to my version, right, the pink area in these graphs, in between these graphs, is comparable. Okay, so the pink area here is telling you the number of excess deaths in each region, and you can see the pink area for Lombardy is much higher. Whereas by moving them here onto separate scales, it's much easier to see the pattern in more detail for each of the areas, but it means that the pink areas are no longer comparable. And so this graph is much more, is telling you more about the individual patterns in the regions, but less about the absolute comparability of their excess mortality, although it does have the absolute numbers. So I think these graphs are answering slightly different questions. And so, like I say, some graphs are better designed to answer some questions than others. And the design choices that you make will be informed by the question you have in your head, or the answer or story that you're trying to present. So usually you'll have an angle to the data that you're trying to present. and you will draw the graph which does that as best you can. And someone else who is using the same data to answer a slightly different question will make different design choices, and that's fine, that's right, okay? But other people looking at your graphs will very unreasonably bring their own questions, right? Everyone won't share your idea of what the most important question to ask is. And sometimes those people will be really cross that your graph doesn't give them the answer that you want, okay? You can't, unfortunately, you can't please all the people all the time because different people want the answers to different questions. And so one possible answer there is, all right, well, why not just make all the graphs? Make every possible graph that you can, and then everyone will be able to find the answer that they want. And so I've tried to do this a little bit, right? So here I've made a few apps to let people explore the data themselves. These are 4 different plots of the same data, right? So this is the number of cases over time by age group. So in the top left, we have absolute numbers of cases, and then in the bottom left we have something similar, but it's now case rate. So you can see in the top right there, there's a highlighting in the oldest age group, which is very small, relatively small. There aren't so many people who are aged over 90, and so if you're just looking at absolute numbers, that doesn't show up very clearly, but if you look at rates, it shows up more clearly. So there's those heat maps on the left, then there's a line graph on the top right, and then there's a stream graph there on the bottom right. And the line graph is much better if you're trying to actually get the absolute numbers. It's much harder to read the absolute numbers off any of the other 3 graphs. But the stream graph in the bottom right is really nice for seeing kind of the flow, the ebb and the flow more qualitatively, I think, of the patterns by age. So these different graphs are answering slightly different questions. And sometimes it's possible to get a bit carried away with trying to make the perfect graph. So I had an interesting conversation with someone a little while ago about these different graphs. And in the end, they suggested that maybe I was giving too much prominence in the rates to the oldest age group, which is really small. So this is a version where the height of each bar, of each kind of row, is proportional to the number of people. And so now when our eye isn't getting drawn to that group of people aged over 90 because there's not that many of them. And so, you know, in some senses, this is an improvement. But then actually, if we're talking about COVID, the risks associated with old age are much greater. So our interest is disproportionately focused on those oldest age groups. So the fact that there's less people there is kind of less important. And so having initially decided this was a great idea, doing this sort of rescaling, I then changed my mind and decided actually it wasn't really very helpful. So you can't ever address all of the questions you want to address at once. So, you know, don't try. But one option, as I have done, is to make websites where people can interrogate the data themselves and create their own graphs. And that's kind of great, right? So this is one that I've made, allowing you to look at excess deaths data by local authorities across England and Wales and Scotland. And you can see there's a few little buttons on the left there, so you can change the scale from linear to log, and those are in response to people who brought slightly different questions to the questions that I'd brought, and had gone, oh, I really want to see this on a log scale because, you know, that's how I like to think about the problem. And so I've added all of those in, try and keep everybody happy. But having, you know, and so there's lots of advantages to doing something like this, but it's not without its downsides because you lose any control of the context. So I'm no longer presenting these graphs myself alongside my own commentary. I've just kind of unleashed all of the possible graphs into the world to let people find them themselves. And sometimes strange things will happen. So a lot of people have taken one of the graphs that you can draw doing this and used it to infer that actually there is no COVID at the moment. It's all just misclassified non-COVID deaths. And even at one point, Peter Hitchens got involved in one of these arguments, which was alarming, I'll say. But so, you know, even this weekend, I picked up my phone to find out 100 notifications and looked, and it turned out that there was two rival schools of people on Twitter arguing, one of them using this graph that I've drawn and the other one using a rebuttal to the use of this graph that I'd previously written, just shouting at each other with my old tweets, which was a rather surreal experience. But you lose control, basically, which is kind of weird, and I'm not really sure how to deal with that. It's been a very strange experience. You know, I don't know that I've got any wise words to share about that. You know, I've tried to deal with it in my own way. Other people would probably have made different decisions, but such is life. Right, now I'm going to talk a bit more about heat maps. So these are these plots that look like this one here on the right hand side. So I like heat maps. I think they're really useful for all sorts of things. So this here is a graph I drew back in January, back in the olden days. This is something that lives in my Deaths of Despair repo on GitHub, right? This is showing deaths among white adults in America from alcohol on the left, drugs in the middle, and suicide on the right by state. And so this is definitely one of the graphs that falls into the second category, I think, of those two categories I gave earlier. This is one where there's a lot of stories going on. And I'm not going to try and tell you them all. So, you know, your eyes might be immediately drawn to New Mexico about 2/3 of the way down there, which is, you know, something very strange is going on there. But you can also see, for example, that you can see the opioid crisis in a few states like Delaware or Maryland or Washington on the right hand side, in the middle of on the right hand side. You can also see a steady rise in many areas from quite low levels in alcohol-related deaths, and you can see that there aren't actually that many patterns over time in suicide deaths. So heat maps could be a good way of encoding a lot of information in a sort of quite a dense way, and that's relatively intuitive. So people don't seem to have too much difficulty interpreting what these mean. Now I said that I often take inspiration from people, and it's important to give credit where credit's due. So my original inspiration for this came from someone on Twitter called Marco Piani, who's drawn a lot of graphs of COVID, and I saw he had a plot like this. So this is COVID cases by state. Each row is a state, and these are called ridge plots. Each one here colored by the number of cases. And one of the really clever things about this is it's normalized for each state. So for each state, the peak daily number of cases, so the day with the most cases, is colored in red, and then every other day is scaled within that state relative to that peak. So what this means is that every state can tell its own story. And then we've got these bars on the right-hand side showing the total number of cases on a log scale. So this was Marco's plot, and then this was my sort of interpretation or version of that. So I changed the ridge plots to a heat map because I thought there's quite a lot of dead space in the ridge plot version, whereas here the whole space is filled with color. And the bars on the right hand side, I colored them by how long they are basically, and put them on a linear on the log scale, because I think for this, generally log scales can be quite confusing, and so you need a good reason for a log scale, and I didn't have a good reason here. So just going to talk a bit more about some of the other design choices or sort of options that have gone on here, right? So I said this is normalized, right? So the peak day in every local authority is the same color, but an alternative is to just look at the absolute number of cases, right? Don't normalize. And that's what the version on the right is, okay? And they both have their own merits. So this version on the right clearly highlights the area of most concern, right? So Kent is that red area there, about a quarter of the way down. But those areas dominate the image, right? You can't really tell so clearly what's going on in some of the other areas. And you could replace this version with rates instead of absolute numbers. But what that does is it gives equal prominence to a tiny local authority with a high rate and a massive local authority with a high rate, when in absolute terms, you're much more worried about a big local authority with a high rate because the total number of cases is much higher. And even then, a small number of areas will still dominate. Whereas this normalized approach means that every area gets to tell its own story. Joe, I'm going to answer your question in a minute. Every area gets to tell its own story. So it's really good for seeing the timeline of the outbreak, right? This red line running up the middle tells you what areas are peaking at the same time, and then when things get a bit more staggered towards the top, you can see there's a bit of a delay and then a kind of a later outbreak in those areas at the top. And by looking across at both the timing of the peak and also that the total number of cases, which is what the bars on the right show, you can kind of infer which areas are the most worrying. But it doesn't directly tell us about case numbers or rates. So it's a bit abstracted from the actual numbers. But I think this is really important. The last point is it's much more visually arresting, I think. It's just quite pretty, basically. And that's, you shouldn't underestimate the value of that for drawing people in and getting people to engage with stuff. So here you go. Joe has preempted my question. What about the ordering of the areas? So here the areas are ordered by the date of the peak. So you kind of this red line moving from bottom left to top right is kind of baked into the design. But you could order them differently, right? So there's advantages and disadvantages to different approaches. So one approach is just to order them from north to south, right? To do it by geography. You could do it alphabetically. And that makes it much easier for anyone to find an area they're particularly interested in, but at the expense of showing patterns. So if we do this from north to south, I would say this isn't very interesting. This doesn't show anything very clearly. Whereas if we ordered a version of the rates from north to south rather than the normalized version, you can see that lump in the north, which happened much earlier than anywhere else. That's really interesting. So I think that different orderings are useful for different versions, depending on what your question is, right? Here, the question is, was the peak in the north earlier than the south? And kind of in general, it was. And this version shows that quite nicely, I think. There you go, up there. That's what I was talking about. So basically, it depends. I mean, that's the answer to most things, I guess. But so what have I learned from all of this, right? Well, the first thing, as I've said, you can't please everyone, right? You can't make the one graph that everyone wants to see, so don't try. Being transparent about what you've done and how you've done it builds trust and credibility. And this is a side bonus I'd never really thought about. You can get other much cleverer people than you to debug your code for free. So you can post your code and then someone will come along and say, oh, you could have done this a bit better, and edit your code for you, which is wonderful. I'm always happy to have cleverer people than me do my work for me. There is an absolutely overwhelming amount of data out there on COVID, and sometimes it's hard to know what it means and what it doesn't mean. But it does mean that it's relatively easy to find a new angle or even a whole new data set that hasn't been widely explored. So there's so much data out there, it's not that hard to find something new or interesting to look at. But it is sometimes hard to know the limitations of the data, of each individual piece of data, what it can and what it can't tell you. And the data landscape is always evolving and is still evolving very quickly. So new data is constantly available. You know, just before I started on this meeting, someone sent me a message to say, oh, have you noticed the PHE COVID dashboard has started publishing something new and interesting? There's always new stuff, but also the stuff that you're previously using is always getting obsoleted, or someone in government moves the columns around just to make sure that your code breaks. And I guess the kind of the key takeaway, right? Be prepared to be wrong, because you will misunderstand what the data is actually representing, or you might have just made a stupid mistake in your code. And so, but don't bury those mistakes, right? If you've misinterpreted data and thought it meant one thing, it's quite likely other people will have done the same thing. So be clear and say, oh, I misunderstood this, and hopefully other people can learn from your mistakes. And try and tell a good story well. Right, I think that's the kind of the key message. If you take nothing else away from this, right, when you're making graphs and visualizations of stuff, try and find a good story and tell it well. That's what you should be trying to do. People are a bit afraid of the idea that you should be using visualizations to tell a story because they think stories are made up. But really, it's like about a narrative. Okay, it's about holding people's hands and guiding them through the interpretation. And slightly facetiously, I'm going to say this here: use nice colors, because we should all use nice colors a bit more. So that is all of my waffle. Does anyone have any questions?
Okay, I'm going to come back in now, Colin, because I've been keeping an eye. Thank you to all of you who picked up on Andy's request to preface your questions with the letter Q. So I'm going to go back to the first question I had, which is from Dave Woodruff, who asks, with COVID, there was a demand for the most up-to-date info, but also a knowledge that reporting lags for things like deaths made recent data inaccurate. How did you trade off these factors?
I mean, I guess that's very true, and that's why initially, for quite a long time, I was very reluctant to look at case data at all, because it's so obviously biased by where tests are being done and to what extent tests are being done. But actually, eventually, I kind of came around to deciding that actually it is useful because it's kind of one of the most leading indicators there is. So it's test data is available within a few days, and that kind of currency is really useful. So I guess all data is useful. It's just about making sure that both you are aware of the limitations and the strengths of the different sources of data, and that you're clear about that when communicating it to other people. I guess that's all I can really say. I'm not sure, any trade-off is inherently a bit subjective, but just be clear about the decisions that you've made.
Okay, thanks, Colin. The next question is from Joe Schofield, who asks a question about slide 71, if you want to rapidly shuffle back about 19 slides. What's the rationale for the ordering of the LA areas, please? If you can remember, Colin.
No, that's a question that I've already answered when talking. So the rationale there is that it shows the kind of that particular ordering, which is ordering by the time at which the areas reach their peak, is kind of it's the prettiest for a start, but also it tells you about the kind of the flow, the time scale of the spread of the pandemic, but at the expense of people being able to readily look up their own one individual local authority. So it's all a trade-off.
Okay, we have a question from Angus Taggart, who asked, do you have any thoughts on encoding the question you are trying to answer with the visualization in the title rather than the story you are telling?
That's an interesting question. I guess so. You don't want, you want to limit the amount of text. I can see someone's asked a question about the amount of text that you should have on a graph. Generally, you don't want too much because it kind of it distracts a bit. And if you've got a big block of text, then no one's going to read it. So I personally, I tend to try and describe the question. Like if I'm putting threads on Twitter of graphs, I will tend to pose the question and then answer it. So I think that's how I tend to do it. I'm not sure if you could make it work to actually put the question in the title. Maybe you can. I don't know. Have a go.
Okay, we have a question from Wilby, who asks, how does this work fit in with your academic career? You're getting lots of engagement and interest, but it doesn't fit into the normal academic outputs model of papers, grants, etc.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Initially, that was I guess maybe more of a concern. I mean, that's kind of why I say this was as much about me trying to make sense of things for my own purposes. This wasn't a strategic decision. I didn't sit down at the beginning of the pandemic and rubbing my hands and go, brilliant, I can make some real hay out of drawing graphs of this. But actually, the pandemic has kind of become such a massive deal and has become so all-encompassing that it's kind of come full circle. It's going to be hard to do research that ignores the impacts of the last 9 months and what's still to come in the future. And so having all of this understanding about what's gone on and what data there is, I think is incredibly useful, is already being incredibly useful. And I guess in terms of the normal academic outputs, I mean, I certainly could have, if I'd been more organized, perhaps written more papers. I mean, there's an enormous slew of COVID-related papers out there. I could certainly have done that, but I just, I haven't for whatever reasons.
Okay. A question from Arjun, who says, when choosing colours, do you consider colour blindness? And he's put in brackets inclusiveness. So do you take that into consideration, or would you, I suppose?
I think that's a great question, and I will hold my hands up to not always getting that right. I have that on my radar as a thing that I should consider. And I sometimes I have got it wrong, and people have called me out rightly on it sometimes and said, I can't read this graph, I'm colorblind. And so I do generally try, but I don't always get it right. And that's certainly something that I can and want to do better.
Okay, a question from Bob Turner. Is there any quantitative research, e.g. psychological experiments, exploring how different visualization approaches affect how data is perceived?
Yes, there definitely is. But I would be lying if I said that I was absolutely on top of what that said. But there's certainly, I saw an interesting paper the other day, which was about how if you draw a kind of a heat map and use different color scales, how people will perceive the differences differently depending on those color scale choices. And there's there's other studies saying that people perceive differences in height, right, differently from differences in area or differences in color. So if it's really important that people can see the absolute difference between two values, then a bar or a line chart is going to be better than a choice where you're using color or area to encode that information.
Okay, and then one last question from John Richmond of ScHARR. Does the timeline for COVID-19 cases by Canadian provinces exist? Have you come across that in your work, Colin?
I'm pretty sure it does exist. The guy, Marco Piani, who I kind of took the inspiration from, I think he's based in Canada. So I would imagine he's probably drawn that. I mean, there is that is something that's been a challenge, is to avoid getting distracted by so much of the data that's out there. I mean, I've generally avoided getting involved in too much international visualization, with a few exceptions, just because there isn't time. It's all fascinating, but there isn't time. I mean, I have, that's part of the motivation for making everything public. I mean, a whole bunch of people have taken the code for those heat maps and made their own version of heat maps. So I've seen people have made versions for Mexico and Indonesia and Bangladesh and Brazil. So I'm delighted if someone wants to take the code that I've written and use it to make a Canadian version. That'd be brilliant.
Okay, and I think one last question. Angus again asks, I take your point about simple graphs, but are we losing the ability to review the conclusions with simpler graphs? Perhaps this is fine when joined with the code data alongside.
I'm not sure what you mean by reviewing the conclusions. I mean, I guess it's sort of what you think the purpose of the graph is. Is it trying to convey a message as clearly and quickly as possible, or is it trying to provide something to make people really think and kind of and sometimes it's not like you always have to choose the same motivation. So it's fine to 1 minute post a graph that does one thing and that just tries to tell a message quickly, and then the next minute post another much more in-depth graph that kind of rewards detailed inspection.
Okay, thanks for that, Colin. Right, I think that's all of the questions that we've had. Thanks to everyone who's posted links of various kinds in the chat, especially to Irene, who posted a link to her visualization about excess deaths over the last 4 years. Carolina, you've tweeted posted a link to a paper that might be of interest. Mark, also of ScHARR, has posted a link to something that might help with the colour blindness issues when coding in R. So lots of useful stuff being posted in the chat. But thank you, Colin. The feedback on this one has been absolutely amazing throughout, and especially at the end. Thank you for your time, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I think this has been our highest turnout one yet. I think we had about 240 people at one point. So thank you everyone for joining us. It has been recorded, so we will be able to send you the link to the recording afterwards, probably within the next couple of hours or so. I'm just going to put my last slide on. So if you are interested in our postgraduate programmes, that email address, shartu@sheffield.ac.uk, is the one. You can post questions about any of our postgraduate courses there. But thanks for joining us, everyone. And like I say, we'll send out the link to the recording as soon as it's done.